Have Americans fatigued on that entirely?
I think that mainstream America is finally looking forward towards the election because just like with Syria and Ukraine before that, and like every other former Eastern Bloc state that Russia has decided to attack, war fatigue sets in, and then we got to look for something else. The emergence of AI in popular culture was only enough to spark interest for what, like 2 weeks?
Yeah, it seems to be fading already, which is where I'm like, there's an inherent problem with that emergence in terms of like consumerism. Like it doesn't work with consumerism, and then it the notion that it like democratizes art is only from people who don't have any art training and want to be able to produce art without any training. So it's effectively stealing the work of all the people who put in the time and effort to get trained and then have their work out there to get scraped. And so I think that's where even then, because you can't copyright AI created art, um, it's going to be really difficult for anybody to be able to make money off of it in terms of like selling a work. And it's going to happen. Like, obviously, nothing is impossible, but I mean, in terms of like, if a screenplay is written by AI and it happens to be good, a studio wouldn't be able to copyright it. So they're not going to put a ton of money into a screenplay that somebody else could come and steal and execute before they have a chance to finish it. So I think that's where like there are limitations on the technology that haven't become apparent yet in terms of like the profitability. And I think it's interesting in terms of AI as a method of accelerating economic growth while also in the process not creating viable means through which people can continue to consume. And and I don't necessarily think that all work is meant to be creating consumers, and that's not meant to be implied at all. But the issue becoming all these companies attempting to replace humans with AI in the process, if even if people consume the things that they produce, there's not, if everyone, like hypothetically, let's say everyone turns to AI where it's possible in every possible job in the economy at the same time, because that would be the worst case scenario. If that happened, all of those displaced people would no longer be able to consume the things that those companies are producing. So their consumer base would be tremendously impacted. So it's not like they would continue to have sales in the same capacity as before. So then they'd have to adjust their models based on a smaller market. And then it's like, what are they even trying to appeal to? So they're going to have to readjust their model. And the people who are left with capital to spend on consumption, like casual consumption, are they going to want to buy AI produced anything? And that's where I think we're going to be hit with this realization of the mythical AI consumer is really non-existent in terms of the person who's willing to pay someone else to produce something with AI. In terms of, if I'm going to watch a movie, if the movie was made with AI and I'm going to pay somebody else to watch that movie, it's going to be a hard task to get enough people to do that to make it worthwhile for an entire studio to make that practice something that they do continuously, because otherwise the person could just go to the AI um like output and make their own thing. So I think it's like,
I mean, it's got to be more than just visually stunning because I could barely
yeah.
watch, Avatar 2. And
Well, have you seen these Wes Anderson AI imitation trailers?
oh no.
It's like, yeah, you can make a sequence of images that's adapted from a story that already exists. So the story in people's minds is already there. So they don't like, the AI isn't doing any lifting in the story. And even further, all of these AI trailers are just taking pre-existing materials and like skinning it with other people. And it's like, if the pre-existing material isn't there, there's nothing to skin. So in essence, AI needs um it needs the material to feed it. And if people are just going to be motion capture subjects to then have their material AI modified from that point on, it's like, I don't I don't think the outcome is what people are assuming in terms of quality. It's going to be a ton of like bullshit. And
It's
I
going to be
can
a lot of stunt actors, physical actors.
not even, okay, so I can point to an example in terms of like what happens when those tools get made available. So if you go to Steam and if you look at the games that are available, there's a range of games that go from like free to 99 cents all the way to $70.
Oh yeah,
And usually the
Far Cry.
$70,
It's the first thing
right,
that
they're
popped up.
reserved for like the AAA titles, which tend to take years and years to make with usually hundreds and sometimes maybe thousands of people involved
So,
on the bigger games.
so Far Cry
So it's
6
like,
is a $60 game that's got a 75% off right now.
and okay, the thing about those sales is interesting is like a game that's a AAA game that costs 200 million, $300 million to make, they can drop the price and at certain times to bring in more users to then when they raise the price again, the users who came in at the lower price point will use word of mouth to justify the higher price point to the other players if the game is good.
Hmm.
And it's a risk when games do it because it's like if you got a bunch of people that come in and then they're like, this game sucks, it's going to make it even worse when you put the game back at the regular price point. So this is what happened with Avengers in terms of like when they put it on sale, their game base surged to like triple, but they hadn't fixed all the bugs yet. So a bunch of people came in and were like, this game is a fucking mess. And then it made it impossible for them to get over that perception. So when they finally fixed the bugs and put it on sale, nobody bought it. So it was like you get these chances as a AAA game. If you don't have a perfect game on release, you can fix the things that are wrong, drop it on, put it on sale, like get people in on the sale window, or sometimes even do like a free weekend, which is really cool. It'll be like free for the entire weekend, but then once the weekend's over, it's back to the regular price. And it's like I've seen this work with games that don't necessarily have the best launch or people don't. It's like when you don't see all of the years and all of the people involved with a game, $70 is a lot. I mean, it's a lot anyway, but when you when you have all these other forms of entertainment, some that are close to free or relatively, so when you're watching a TV show, you're not thinking this is like X percentage of what I pay for internet access or cable per month. It's like it's tantamount to being free. So then when you watch a movie, it's like, okay, I'm paying 15 or whatever, how many dollars for this 2 hours worth of entertainment. So then if you buy a video game, you don't think of it in terms of like dollars per hour. It's like this experience is $70. So it's got to be a good experience to warrant the $70. And in a lot of cases, when you break it down per hour, a video game, even at the $70 price point, can still be way cheaper than a movie. But because you have to pay generally all at once, you're not going to perceive it that way. And it's like people are more and more hesitant to drop $70 on a game when it's less than 10 hours long or like um, it's too difficult and you can't beat. So there's a lot of things that individuals are going to have different issues with. Um, but if the game isn't working at all, then people are really not going to want to pay $70. So that's what's happening with a lot of these AAA games is they're releasing and they're broken in ways that are irredeemable until they patch them up. So like Cyberpunk is an example, but they had so many people who had pre-bought the game that they weren't gonna.
Cyberpunk.
They were so invested that they weren't gonna like trash the game because they wanted other people to keep buying. And what's crazy is that game still ended up being a success, even though it was clearly broken. And in terms of like I think there was a lawsuit associated with it, and like because the CD Projekt Red as the studio effectively misled the investors in terms of how complete the game was or what the game was going to do. When they were releasing the previews, they were basically just lying about it, and lying about like what was possible. Um, so it's like I'm I'm always hesitant to buy a game when it first comes out because they're usually broken anymore. But what I was getting at is the assets that are available, because now gaming studios have to compete with like some individual who can go purchase a bunch of 3D assets and make a decent game as an individual. They have to end up pushing out these things that are inferior because they have deadlines and they have um, shareholders. So it's like over time, the actual quality of games has gone down because there's just so much crap to choose from that it ends up becoming like more difficult to justify putting money into something that is like a masterpiece because people will still buy it even if it's not. And then in the process, there's far fewer masterpieces because the studios don't have to end up going that far to get the consumer, because whether it's because the consumer is um, non-judicious with their dollar or they're chasing some sort of fun dragon, the studio doesn't have to make a perfect game. A perfect example is with Grand Theft Auto. Like, not to say that the game wasn't perfect. They don't have to make Grand Theft Auto 6 because people are still playing Grand Theft Auto 5 in enough numbers and still buying the game to the point where it's like, well, if you continue to buy Grand Theft Auto 5, why would I make Grand Theft Auto 6? Like, the way that the market has evolved.
Well, I think that's the sign of a good game. Like I keep
That's
playing Star Trek
true.
Online, and I've got one tune that's so developed that if I want to just reload for a different whatever the current event is, I just go grind 3 or 4 missions, and then I have a weapon setup that's like finely tuned for whatever adversary this next event is all focused on. And then it's just easy and it's fun because at this point the game itself, the mechanics of the game are very well established, and it's the missions themselves are actually story driven, so I can play that and have fun. And then at the end I get to hear Spock tell me I did a good job. I mean, really, I think that's what any Star Trek fan is, to hear Spock say like good job.
Well, and then that's, of course, reasonable, but there's this idea that if you make one good thing, then you have to make another and make it better. And it's like, I guess Grand Theft Auto 3 was really the first 3D version um, of that game that we all think of when we talk about Grand Theft Auto. But it's like if they had stopped at 2, we never would have gotten 3 in terms of like that play style. So there, on the one hand, I do understand that there's this need to like keep innovating, but it's also hard to know when something is like just a poor imitation. And I think that's where like the impetus to keep reproducing that innovation success is how we end up with so much crap. But also, I think Rockstar has learned from a lot of their rushed bullshit. Like, the bully games, the first one wasn't bad, but they were clearly just like, oh, what if you did Grand Theft Auto in a school? And it's like, okay, that premise works for like about the first 5 hours of the game, and then after a while, it's like, okay, this is clearly just a hollow shell. Um, and they had other games, um, like some mayhem. I forget the some. It was like in a mall, but it was like you you could tell that they just took one of the mechanics of the shooting from Grand Theft Auto, and it's like, what if we just put this in a mall? And it was like constant destruction, and that shit gets old after like an hour or two. Um, and then they made Red Dead Redemption, which is like, or
Yeah, Red Dead. That's
yeah,
that's like
like,
I got a really big Westworld vibe when I played that game the first time.
well, and it's because you want to associate it with Grand Theft Auto as if they're taking place in the same universe in terms of like, it does feel like the simulation's going to shut down and fucking then it's going to shift into the modern times in the same way that Assassin's Creed does. So I think that's where um, because of the visuals, I think they had it right before the images started getting, or like the game started getting really photorealistic. So there's still this like simulation vibe to it. Um, but even then, those games had story. And I think this is another issue where the storylines that happen between Grand Theft Auto, well, 4 and then 5, and I guess San Andreas too. You can't forget San Andreas, and Vice City is just the Scarface clone, but that gets to the point of like when you do referential stuff, it can be done well in a way that makes something new and it makes it novel without destroying the homage or making the homage covert, and the homage being overt adds to the whole experience, because then it's like, I don't know if you ever played Vice City, but when they have the climax of the game being like effectively the same as the climax of Scarface, it's like, okay, I see what you're doing. It's fun. They made their own little changes, so it's not exactly the same, but it's like, you know, it's not original, but it's novel. And I think there's things that can be done that aren't original but are novel that end up being good, but it's still really difficult to do. It's not easy. So I think that's where the AI is going to make it seem like it's easy to make novel stuff that's good, but it's still going to take enough time and effort to actually get the thing to the point where it's like, well, we might as well have just hired the person or the group that we're trying to imitate, because we have to go through iterations to get to that point anyway. So it's like, it, it's gonna, for a brief period, seem like AI is gonna do all this stuff, but then after all these companies test, it's gonna they're gonna realize it's just as easy for them to just go to the directly to the humans in the first place. And I think that's where, like, if it's truly about a human consumer or pleasing a human at the end, bots can't, or AI can't take that place ultimately. And I think that's where, like, certain things, it's going to look a certain way in terms of how AI is like um manifesting. So especially for example with the medical AI, well, of course something that tells you what you want to hear is going to be more empathetic than somebody who tells you the thing that you don't want to hear. And this is like in reference to the medical AI getting rated as more empathetic than doctors. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, it's not going to tell you what you don't want to hear. And I think we've seen over and over AI is willing to just make things up and lie in terms of if the information is not readily available, sometimes it will say as much, but other times it just they call it hallucinating, but it's really just making things up. And it's like when AI starts hallucinating and fabricating responses to make people happy, well, of course, that thing is going to do better than a doctor in terms of looking empathetic. So I I'm not really surprised by those types of outcomes. And I think that's where there's certain things that are going to happen um and the doom like it's weird in terms of like you would think that the people who are pro AI are like the optimistic people, but the people who think the AI is going to proliferate are often doomsday or like doom and gloomers in terms of how they're framing it from taking jobs as if it'll get that far. And that's where I'm like, I can't see it actually getting that far in terms of the way that companies take risks is very slow and it's not quick and it's not going to be like the writing strike, for example, because of the way that that is playing out in tandem with rights of AI generated scripts still not being protected. I don't think that they're gonna try to lean on AI as much as they still will try to find scabs to cross the picket line, and that's where they'll definitely test AI. But testing and deploying are two completely different things. Like we're still very much in the test phases, and it's gonna be at least a year before any company realistically deploys any sort of AI product that's like shifting their
Wait, crap! There are 8 Yakuza games.
feels like there's more than that.
Okay, well, I have a list that it only goes to 2020. There are at least 8 Yakuza games, maybe
Yeah, I
more.
think there's more than that. I'm pretty sure there's more
I
than
mean,
that.
that's just basically GTA in feudal Japan. Or no, no, not no, no,
But
across the ages of Japan.
it's more it's weird. It's more like Saints Row in terms of like making fun of the JRPG genre. Like it's more making fun of Japanese RPGs than trying to be like GTA.
Mm,
Um, but it's also and it's like
that's a really fun game. Well, it's franchise.
yeah, they're fun. I mean, they're really fun, but that's where they don't take themselves seriously in terms of how they play, but the appearance is taken seriously in terms of the graphics quality. So it's like, yeah, it looks good. It looks like GTA quality game, like, but it's more in tongue in cheek as like Saints Row, which granted GTA has some uh self-deprecating
Oh, 80s
tones to
life,
it.
80s Japan. Oh, that's even okay. So this is just like this is tongue-in-cheek GTA in Japan with Japanese crime and disco.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like not even like the crime is almost the least part of it realistically. There's definitely fighting and shit, but there's so many mini games and like side quests where you're like
I have not played this
not
game in a long time.
well, and there's different like some of the tones of the games are different too.
Yakuza. Yakuza O is or Zero is one of the most eccentric, idiosyncratic, and downright charming games around. 90 out of 100 PC gamer. Oh, that's funny.
Oh, that's what it was. There was two remakes. That's why it feels like there's more. Yeah.
I don't spend that much time on Steam. Occasionally, I get a notification that some game I thought I was interested in, like a couple of years ago, is on sale now. I like Steam though. It's kind of they've got their whole self-contained universe is very nice. And when I've set up a computer just to run Steam and only Steam, it's about as flawless and or seamless an experience as it gets. Might as well be a console.
Well, that's why they released the Steam Deck. So I
Yeah.
think in terms of now they've created this whole well, they didn't necessarily create it, but
Oh,
as
they help to
far as
foster the
making
emergence of this whole environment.
handheld PCs, yeah, because it's like there's a difference between a Switch and a handheld PC,
Yeah.
um, in a laptop. So I think that's where Valve definitely, they borrowed from Nintendo and Sega, but in terms of like creating this handheld device that's capable of also being functioning as like a PC, I think that's where I I don't see them necessarily challenging Sony or anything like that. But if they stay in their lane, I think they're gonna become like an establishment within the console pantheon. Like once they get
Are they still pursuing
the
that
batteries better.
ridiculous looking headset?
I mean, they still sell it. Yeah,
I
you're
mean, are
talking
they
about
still?
the VR.
Yeah, the VR headset thing. Are they still
Yeah.
like developing that?
I mean, it's hard to say because Meta basically killed the VR space,
Yeah, but
and
they had that.
it's like
They have their own hardware.
I know, but I'm saying they killed the entire space because the issue is like if people are looking at Meta and there's not a ton of interest in that, then it translates into like people not buying the Valve headsets are more expensive.
Yeah, they're like a
So it's
thousand
like
dollars.
if the VR image is like already tarnished because Meta is what's dominating, like the Steam VR offerings were like way not necessarily better, but they're different in terms of the the gaming studios are more independent, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad. And especially with assets being offered, it was like you would find games on the way more games on Steam VR than in the Oculus shop. Well, bef- before Meta bought it, and after they bought it, I don't think they necessarily made it more likely that you're going to find games in the Oculus store. So they might have. I think they got like the Iron Man game, which I don't think it was anything special. I don't think they had exclusive rights to the Spider-Man. The Spider-Man experience wasn't even a full game. It was fun, but they had one on the Oculus for a while. I think. I mean, I'm sure it's still there, but for a while they had one that other people couldn't get. So there's certain things that they were like, oh, we'll try to get this exclusive Avengers VR game, and you can play as Spider-Man and Iron Man that you can't get on Steam. But that wasn't competing with like all the independent games that Valve um they weren't making them. Obviously, this is like coming from different people, but because Valve opened up their shop to independent, it was like much easier for people to produce.
Yeah, it looks like the HTC product is still $1,000, and the Hewlett Packard product is also in like the $600 to $900 range.
Yeah, the prices never really went down because people weren't really buying them.
I mean,
The
that's a whole computer. That's a whole really powerful
I mean,
laptop.
it is, and that's part of it is like you're basically wearing a whole computer on your face.
Yeah,
Um, Even though it still usually needs a computer to work with it.
to just supplement it.
Yeah, which is also where the Oculus or yeah, whatever company you want to call it, the
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 meticulous.
headsets, the headsets that weren't connected to computer could offer a good experience, but it's just not going to compete with one that's actually connected to a computer. So there's this element of VR headsets that don't have a computer supporting it, only being able to get to this. Like, it's not a bad experience, but it's just not the same as one that's also got like a RTX 3080 or some shit powering it, or 3090, or it don't have to even be that powerful of a card, but um the experience was just the price entry curve being so high for the good experience, and then Meta ruining the perception of the low end headsets because nobody wants to go work in VR. That's what they were basically pushing in terms of the perception of what VR was going to be used for. So in them not highlighting or encouraging the game space to develop, the entire VR space suffered by proxy, which is why, yeah, the Valve headset's still fucking $1,000, and it's absurd. It shouldn't be $1,000 for that headset in 2023. Um, but I don't know if the VR space is gonna. It's not gonna go away because they have so much production in place where it's like there's too many headsets out there to just go away.
A
But
HoloLens one is still $1,500 used, and a new HoloLens,
it's like 4 grand, right?
yeah, four
Like
grand,
3,800.
$4,000 and 35, 4,000. You know, there's a 3898. That's a 3,900. Damn, what the crap? Here's a physical model for $500. It's not an actual headset though. Just looks like a HoloLens.
But then it's like, what is anybody going to use that for?
they're they're
Realistically,
gonna wave their hands around their office while they engage in a Teams meeting, and
for like 2 weeks, and then they're going to realize, oh, fuck, the mouse and the keyboard's still actually better. And then that thing is going to sit on their shelf and collect dust
then they're
as a
gonna be like,
$4,000 paperweight.
and then they're gonna be like, where did I move that notepad file? Shit, it's over here somewhere.
Well, but that's what's happening with a lot of the Steam Decks in terms of if I already have a gaming computer, I don't need a Steam Deck unless I'm going to go travel a lot, which even then it's like if I'm traveling, I'm not really playing video games necessarily. So it's like almost a waste to take it traveling. Unless you don't have a gaming computer, there's this I feel like the people who bought Steam Decks didn't really need them in the first place, and they realized it and then didn't use them. Um, so I don't know if they necessarily are representative of the proper demographic of people who will actually use them. But once they get their batteries better, is when I think you'll see people in public spaces using them. Like, um, there was a while when like the PlayStation Portable, this shit was everywhere. When those were mainstream gaming, you'd see people on the bus, like in the library, in public spaces that were like, McDonald's or whatever. People were on PlayStation Portables everywhere. I don't see that same thing with the Steam Deck. You'll see people with the Switch playing in public. Like that's fairly frequently, as a matter of fact. But it's usually kids, so it's like even then, like I don't know if adults game in public spaces as much anymore. Um, Whereas again, when it was like the PlayStation Portable, yeah, adults were gaming everywhere. Um, I guess Pokemon Go is probably the most adults gaming in public thing probably ever. But that didn't last very long. It's still happening, but not to the extent that it was.
Yeah.
That fad was interesting in terms of watching the reaction to it. It was so strong. Um,
Steam Deck doesn't really have that much processing power.
well,
It,
most of the games on Steam don't need it that much.
yeah.
That's what I'm getting at in terms of when you go look at the games, 99% of them are not AAA games on Steam.
Yeah.
And it's that doesn't mean they're not fun at all.
Oh
That
man,
just
I
means
wouldn't even pretend to try to show somebody Star Trek online on a 1280 by 800 pixel screen. That's only 7 inches diagonal. No, that would just be painful. I mean, it looks cool, but I feel like this is the kind of thing that would end up plugged into a dock right next to a real monitor with
right, and they have
with a
those,
real
which again,
keyboard and mouse, and so it just becomes a portable computer with that lacks a real keyboard. So you end up having to carry around another keyboard. And it's the same issue with an iPad. I have it so I can control a few pieces of technology that, for whatever dumb reason, PC control software does not exist. Computer software does not exist to control technology that has USB ports, but there's a freaking iPad app that controls them. That's fine. I have this device that I really only use for a few things, and it works perfectly for those things. But I'm not going to pretend that it's like even anywhere near as capable as my computer. even if it could like keep up performance wise, it lacks the kind of like inputs and output devices. It has one port that has to be replicated across like additional ports versus any normal computer has at least two USB ports, unless it's like a tablet computer, which probably has a specialized port like an iPad.
Well, but then you see barely any computers have any disk,
Yeah.
um, like disk loaders anymore. We have to use an old one anytime it's like a disk based file, which is where not many people still use disk based files, but ever so often it'll happen. I'm like amazed at the lack of input, like CD, DV port, DVR, or DVD ports on my computers. Um, but it's that's so normal. Like to be in a post CD computer era where everything is USB is very. I mean, it's not strange, but like the idea of it, we're so far in the evolution of machines and information. It's like I feel like we've seen enough evolutions to have good gauges on why this AI is not the evolution that people are claiming. And I think again, same shit happened with crypto. There was a bunch of people who, for years and years and years were claiming that crypto is going to be the next like fucking internet in terms of its importance technology wise. And that just didn't play out that way. It's not over yet. Like crypto and blockchain technology could still proliferate in ways that, are still useful. But it's just not doing the stuff that people were claiming it was going to do in the very beginning. And I think that's where,
So years ago, you used to be able to buy like Native Instruments complete contact suite or whatever, and it was really expensive. Right now, I'm looking at it, and it's like $1,800. But a few years ago, you'd actually get a hard drive or a solid state disk maybe that contained all of these files on it. Now you just get to download it. There's no hard drive or disk to load for this anymore. Crazy. Like I have a box with Reason 6 in it, and there's an optical media, and let's see what else. There's like some kind of dongle that actually lives inside my computer that identifies my account and all that, and says that I'm allowed to have this copy running without having to communicate with the internet. I don't even know if that kind of thing exists. I think they do all the authentication online now, and they write some kind of like GUID key, and they keep track of that. I'm not even sure physical media even exists anywhere. Like,
yeah, right.
when
Yeah,
is
it's
the
so
last
hard to
time you saw
find.
a box with physical media in it? It's like usually it's you end up just. I mean, I haven't seen a box of physical media in a store ever. Like not in the last
Well,
several years.
I just happened to go into
Be a
Best
decade.
Buy and their DVD section is like I guess Blu-ray and slash DVD. It's like
Like paper slips
it
that
was
you
maybe
take to
like
the.
40 feet long and one side. It was like one side of the shelves because you know how they have the two-sided shelves. It was like one side was Blu-ray DVDs and the other side of that was Nintendo Wii stuff or Wii U, and then the other side was Xbox, and then the other side was PlayStation. So all the physical media stuff is only one row each of it's only taking up one side of a row anymore. Um, because then I think there was like maybe 2 feet of vinyl.
They actually had vinyl.
Yeah, but it was like 2 feet. And I mean like I literally mean like a 2 foot gap on the shelf. And it wasn't full. It definitely wasn't full. There was space for 2 feet worth of vinyl, but maybe like 4 inches of it actually had
In your estimate,
vinyl in there.
do they have
Yeah,
more
from
floor
my
space
memory.
dedicated to containers to transport stuff in than they do to physical media?
No, no. Well, they don't have any of that transport stuff anymore either.
They don't have
Because it's
like
like,
they don't have like bags for things and cases for phones and um
oh, you're talking about that stuff. That's a yeah, that's in a different section. But I'm talking about like, you remember when you go to a store and there was like CD racks
yeah.
for storing CDs, like shit like that. They don't have, and that's what I mean. Like, oh, a
Oh
DVD
wow.
shelf.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
no,
they,
you're
they
not
don't
gonna
have any
find
they
that.
don't have any furniture like that anymore.
Yeah, not like storage for physical media.
Wow. Yeah, so if there's no storage, then nobody's going to buy stuff to put in it because they don't know where to put it. They're like, where am I going to put this stuff? I mean, can I just stack it and put it in the corner? Actually, I remember going to a lot of apartments where that was the case. Like a very neatly
Yeah,
stacked like
because
tower of CDs, cases, and DVDs.
because for a while there was an industry built around that physical holder, and it would be like, oh, you want a 300 CD holder? That's $300, and it's like, wait, hold up, what? And then you'd realize like it's to make rich people feel like they have this upper. I mean, not just for that, but there never should have been an industry built around that because it was inevitably going to die, and they probably thought they were going to be around forever. But it got so out of hand where it's like DVD racks and CD racks and the fucking CD players that would hold 100 CDs, completely unnecessary. Fucking completely. Oh, you don't want to have to change your CDs. You can just have this thing hold 100, and it's like for about 3 years that was high technology. Now it looks so over engineered and it's so ridiculous, but it's also, you can tell they just were like, oh, what, we'll take a jukebox and we'll shrink it down. That's the best plan. Jukebox, CDs, put them together. And it's like, when people or companies, not people, companies were making $1,000 CD players that could hold 100, but only play one at a time. It's like, okay, guys, let's think about this. Is this going to be something technology wise that people are going to be using in 20 years? Do you care? No. Well, I guess go ahead and make it. But in that, I feel like that's where a lot of companies, not that specific, but that type of thinking and approach to appeasing a market that doesn't know what it wants, is like tying your identity and your existence to something nebulous. And that's where,
I had one of those Pioneer.
I mean, I had one
I
too
think
at
it was
one
like
point
a
once they got cheap.
yeah, like I got it at a no, I think I got it at a yard sale. Like someone was moving out, like they graduated, they were leaving, they were getting rid of their electronics. I think I bought it for like $20 or $15 or $10. I probably wouldn't have paid very much for it actually now I think about it. And I loved that thing until it broke, and then it was like a nightmare to get the CDs out of it because they were in this weird carousel that was only accessible from 2 points, and then the thing wouldn't turn, and I had to break it to get them out of it. I mean, the motor already failed, so it was already done for. But
Yeah, those things were not fun once they broke. And they definitely all broke.
the ones that only had like 5 CDs, those things seemed to last forever.
Yeah, yeah.
But they were
Well, a
also
lot
like
of them were in
real heavy.
cars.
Oh god, the weird cassette thing that you loaded 6 of them into or whatever like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, those are a nightmare. The ones that I hated were the CD players where you could feed multiple discs into one unit, like through the
Oh
faceplate,
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah. They
you
would get stuck.
they would get jammed in there and you would never get them out because those cages were made out of like solid steel. There were a lot of pieces of technology, like consumer electronics, that at the time seemed like a good idea, and they solved somebody else's problem. But I think they all eventually ultimately became someone's problem.
Yeah, how much of that stuff is in Goodwill now?
Fuck, how much of it still works? I bet none of it still works. I bet it all broke. I bet every single one of those carousel monstrosities, like 25 plus disc carousel things, they all failed, and somebody was cursing Pioneer or Sony or Iowa or Panasonic or whatever for designing such a horrible piece of crap. That's what they all became. There's so many pieces. There's so many like stereos. I remember having a lot of Pioneer electronics, and they all sounded fine. Everything, music was. I think music wasn't as loud for one thing, but there were like different sonic requirements. I remember before everyone had started having stereo subwoofers. That was like not common when I was in high school, and then it started to become more common like right as I was getting out of high school. And I remember,
Well, because the prices went
yeah,
down,
the
or they
prices
started to go
started going
down.
down. People realized, hey, I can do this myself.
It was so ridiculously expensive when we were in middle school.
Yeah,
And then when we were in high school, this prices like started to go down tremendously. Um, but then now it's like, it's straight up affordable in terms of I think it costs like $800 to get a sub, the box, the amp, the wiring, and the installation. Uh, which 10 years before that, it would have cost as much, if not more. And without inflation, that shit was like way more expensive. So,
and the equipment was heavier, and it wasn't as good
mhm.
as it is now. No, that's not true. Some of those subwoofers are amazing, and you can't find them anymore. But a lot of those capabilities have been achieved by new material processes, new manufacturing processes, better magnet structures, better magnet material, all that kind of stuff. All of the improvements that have happened in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And then the influence on the music culture that creates music for those kinds of playback systems. Because the person who's making music for a banging car system, they don't care what it sounds like inside of somebody's living room, unless that person's living room has a gigantic subwoofer, like a 10 times power versus the main system subwoofer, and that's uncommon.
Well, I do. Yeah. On that note, I think there is access to like the types of speaker systems that people want. So somebody who is making like car music, yeah, they don't give a shit about anybody else, and they can be that focused on their specific audience, because they'll know that there's enough people willing to, well, not just willing, but capable of buying that. music to make it worth the time. And this gets back to the thing in terms of if AI is putting out something, is that audience gonna be present? Like the audience is willing to put out money or to put money towards something that was produced by
No,
AI,
that's
and that's where I'm
that's a
like,
really good point. A human who has experienced music at really high SPL, presumably while wearing hearing protection, of course, understands how that feels to the body. But how is an AI going to interpret that? How does an AI, even if it has a microphone in the room, listen? I mean, how does it know? How does it know what it's like to hear music like that at full volume and be 60 feet away from the speaker array, and then be and know what it feels like to feel the full force of that deep bass? Because it sounds very different in a room, and it sounds very different on small speakers, and headphones just rattle eventually. But like the sound of techno, like that deep subsonic rumble, one has to experience that to know what it actually feels like. You can't just look at a waveform or interpret voltage and know what that's gonna how it's gonna feel at those levels. I think that's actually a real reason that a lot of people scoff at the idea of techno until they've heard it, and then they may not decide to listen to it regularly. But once you've experienced techno on a proper playback system, holy crap! It's no, that stuff's actually pretty cool. No matter how weird it is, and techno can get pretty weird. But how is a computer supposed to know what those things actually sound like?
well, and I've been thinking about this in terms of like, what does it care?
It doesn't. It doesn't
It
have any
doesn't.
intent.
It doesn't, and that's obviously that's a problem. But I think that's where, um, even in terms of like, okay, there's this game, Marvel Snap, and it's a card game, and
Okay.
there's real players and there's bots. And one of the things that's been happening is the bots cheat, and I'm like, why do the bots actually care about? They don't care about winning, but why are the developers making the bots designed to care so much about beating the players? Because at that point, that's design because the bots don't actually care. And it's like it's hard as a player to look at this design knowing it's not a real human. This is like an algorithm using its data to pretend to be a human and display intelligence. On the one hand, trying to imitate a human wanting to win is like, okay, that makes sense in the context of a game. But then that's where I'm like, why? Let's assume this bot is alive. Why would we also then assume that it's wants to even play? Like it might just want to quit and walk away. It might not want to win the game. It might just like the notion of trying to make something appear to have human thought and human element, but then also force it to want to win is like a weird contradiction of goals in a way that I don't think that a lot of these developers are thinking about in terms of how they're designing these bots.
Yeah, the bot has a crock pot sitting on the counter at home and really wants to get back and eat dinner tonight. So its goal isn't really just to win, it's just to survive long enough that you give up. That way it can go home to its bot family and feed its bot dog and eat its bot pot roast because the bot Crockpot is just, sitting there stewing away. There's a whole bot life that exists that no one ever knows about because it's behind the veil, and we don't actually care because that's way too much information about this thing that's trying to presumably destroy our avatar or our tune.
Yeah. And in terms of like that notion of the bot having a life, it's like that inherent contradiction of like we want it to appear to have life, but we also want it to specifically do this one thing and be restricted to this one thing. That it's like the contradiction is too much of a limitation to actually give the appearance of being human, because then it starts doing things that a human would never do. Um, and it's like, I think there's good bot behaviors and bad bot behaviors that like mimic good human behaviors and bad human behaviors. So then when the more they mimic one or the other, the more difficult it knows to become if it's like a human or a bot pretending to be human. So I get that notion when you're trying to like populate something that isn't populated with real humans and make it seem like it. But that's also why there is an inherent contradiction of like giving them an ultimate goal that is like associated with a human desire, because then I think that's why it's like it appears to be so fake, because it's like, well, I can't imagine necessarily what a bot would want to do, but I can imagine that it's not the same thing as me. Like if I'm playing a video game, I don't know why a bot would want to go do that same thing unless there's a
Generally, a piece of software that's designed to preserve itself and propagate is kind of that has any kind of malicious intent is kind of called a virus, I believe,
right. I mean,
or malware.
yeah, and in that note, like
Even if
pretending to be a human sometimes includes negative behaviors, which is why I think it then becomes dangerous to then try to imitate human behavior with things that are not sentient, to trick humans into thinking that they're engaging with humans, because then it starts to modify expectations in like unexpected ways too. So that's where I'm like, I see this thing happening on a small scale with the game, where I'm starting to see it happen at a large scale with AI creations and the human response. And it's like in the game, people are not responding well to the bots because the bots aren't behaving in ways that humans would. And it then becomes like, this isn't what we're here for. And I think that's where, like, if we gave an algorithm free reign to make a movie without any sort of input and any sort of prompt, I highly doubt that the output is going to be something that most humans want to see. And that's where the human need for some end is what's driving a lot of the bot creation in the first place. So this is where the notion of taking out that human need and having algorithms creating things to then give humans, I feel like it's dead on arrival. Because that's where I mean, like, even it's really difficult for game studios to get AI, like bots right, when it comes to observe their algorithms will take in input, calculate, and then act on that input and calculations in ways that sometimes when somebody's playing, it can then create a layer of immersion and believability. But that's really difficult to achieve, which is why there's only one Grand Theft Auto 5, or there's only one. Um, I can't even really think of anything that achieves that level of immersion. Uh, Mass Effect 1 and 3 um, had pretty good NPCs. Uh, oh, what's it called? Uh,
World of Warcraft.
Warcraft is good. They have some good NPCs. Elden Ring. I keep thinking. Uh, anyway,
What was the one where people keep getting shot in the knee?
Skyrim.
There we go.
Skyrim.
That's it.
Fucking Skyrim. Yeah, Skyrim has good NPCs. Um, but those are like the exceptions and not the rules. So that's where I mean, decades and decades of game design, even the best of the best still aren't necessarily good at creating believable non-human behaviors, or non-human behaviors that are intending to mimic human desires. And I think that's where like it's going to appear at first when the AI is just copying a bunch of pre-existing storylines and pre-existing faces and facial expressions, that it's creating something that is, or it has the capacity to create something that would please humans. But that's where, again, like without some sort of modification, there's going to be a gap between what humans want and what humans expect and the output, that it's just going to be enough of a gap even after modification, because it's like, yeah, they'll make that gap smaller and smaller and smaller, but there's still going to be that gap, and it's still going to take modification, and as much modification as it needs, it'll just be easier to go to the human in the first place ultimately. And I think once, I don't know how long it's going to take for studios to hit that point, but I believe they will hit that point. And I think it's like whenever they made RPG Maker or um, fighting game, fight game maker, there's like these uh, engines that make it really easy to output a certain type of game. So if you want to make an RPG, you just buy that RPG Maker engine, and all you have to do is basically put in the the names of the things you want. You know, you can put in the story, but then they make it easy for you to like auto suggest stories, and it's like it's one of the reasons there's so much crap on Steam, but it also doesn't prevent fucking the new Zelda game from being made. Um, and I think, you know, the more I look around and see mass produced uh, options put in juxtaposition with the top shelf, high quality offerings, it's like almost in every venue, the mass produced doesn't get rid of the top shelf. And like Budweiser didn't put craft breweries out of business. If anything, Budweiser existing made craft breweries proliferate. It took time. It didn't happen overnight, but you know, Keystone Light and Natural Light and Coors Light didn't make people stop drinking IPAs, and it didn't stop make people from drinking Bloomington Brewing Company and the Goose Islands and the you know
Insert local or regional brewing
right
company.
any brewery that still exists is not at the it's not in spite or out of opposition of the large companies, and it's they exist on their own merit. And that's where it's like, on the one hand, like there's definitely nepotism and there's definitely um, manipulation of markets and things like that. That's not to say those things don't exist, but in that context, if somebody's doing something good, it's very likely that they'll be able to at least find somebody to recognize the quality in their output or in their product or whatever they're doing. Not to say that they'll be able to become rich or become necessarily wealthy from that, but artistry is not it's not easily occluded. And I think that's because when you are an artist, you're gonna have people who appreciate your art, and that's where it's ultimately about creating a connection. And even if it's like food or you know the chef finding someone to appreciate their culinary skills, that that connection requires two sides, and AI doesn't have the other side. And I think that's why ultimately it's going to have a really hard time connecting to an audience because it doesn't have the desire to connect. And that's like, it sounds almost benign, but it's such an important part of producing things, period. Whether it like, you know, whether it's art or food.
How are people going to relate to the music created by something that doesn't feel anything?
Is it even possible? And you know,
Like the idea of AI soul all of a sudden becomes really amusing to me. Because that's
can AI make soul music?
I mean, now we're just being mean. Could AI ever even know what funk is?
And I think in a formulaic, you know, assessment, someone would say yes, but in reality,
I'm not sure that person knows what funk is.
right, exactly.
Like,
And I think that's the issue is like some people will pretend to know or pretend to understand things that are beyond them, and then when someone imitates it, they won't understand the difference either, so it looks the same. Because that's where like I don't like Jackson Pollock's paintings, period. But when people are like, "Oh, my 4-year-old could do that," shut the fuck up. No, they couldn't. No, the fuck they couldn't. No, no, they couldn't. Sorry, because there's no 4-year-old Jackson Pollock that has ever fucking emerged. If if a 4-year-old could do it, we would have seen it by now. There's been plenty of fucking yeah, plenty of 4-year-olds and plenty of self-assured parents that think their 4-year-olds can fucking do it. And surely we'd have one by now. There was like a girl at one point that they were trying to say was that, but then the art critics came in and were like, yeah, this is not good. The use of colors, it's elementary, literally. And that's where it's like, I don't like Jackson Pollock's art, but to act like a kid could do the same sort of color combinations or theoretical constructions to then have the output in the emotional response.
I,
No, a kid is not emotional. Like a 4 year old is not emotionally
I
complex enough
I think it would
to
actually
create an
be
emotional response.
it'd be extremely irresponsible of any parents to allow their children to be exposed to the volume of oil paint that Jackson Pollock went through just on one painting, and especially
Yeah,
considering the
seriously.
size of developing lungs and the effect on developing neurological tissue. Like, there's the nervous system, everything about the idea of exposing children to the that a 4-year-old wouldn't come out of the end of that whole process like irreparably damaged on a physical and nervous system level. Like, whoa, oh. That right there also communicates that I'm not sure that people who say their 4-year-old could do that even understand just what that means.
No, they definitely don't. And I think that's the issue is like, those people because they've achieved a certain like they own a home or they've paid off their car or some shit. They think that they can then make a judgment about Jackson Pollock. Like it's like this weird extension of meaningful opinion because you can vote and you have a mortgage or whatever in terms of like owning property in America is such a huge deal in terms of giving somebody an opinion. And it's like once you own property, you can have a fucking opinion about anything. And other people who own property are going to take that opinion more seriously than somebody who doesn't own property. That's fucked up. That is really fucked up because that person doesn't necessarily know shit about that thing that they have an opinion about. Because they own property, there's something in an American's head that's like, well, they did this one thing, so I'm going to take their opinion slightly more, like, slightly higher than somebody who doesn't own property. And it's like, that almost has more influence than a medical degree in terms of like, if it didn't, now it sounds crazy, but if it didn't, we wouldn't have had such a fucking problem trying to get people to mask up. But because Joe Rogan owns a bunch of fucking property, now all of a sudden he can challenge Dr. Fauci. That's exactly what happened. Because Joe Rogan owns more property than Dr. Fauci, suddenly he can challenge that motherfucker's opinion. So it's like, I know it sounds crazy to break it down to something so base and so ridiculous. But that's what America is. It's like a land of people who restricted property ownership to one demographic for so long because they held that one thing in such high esteem for so long because they couldn't even do it for so long. When you're coming out of feudalism, when you're coming out of a period where your fucking grandfather wasn't allowed to own property, your fucking father wasn't allowed to own property, but you had to watch these motherfuckers work. And then you're like, oh, I can become a property owner. That shit means a lot. So I'm not saying I don't get it, but the post feudal American emphasis on property ownership is having merits to give someone an opinion on other things. It's so ingrained in Americans that they don't even know what's happening. And that's where I'm like, it's all about the property ownership because when you look at it, the property ownership is the thing that has been the most restricted to up to the most recent times in terms of like, yeah, the vote is like part of it, but the vote is also tied to ability to own property and ability to exist as a property owner, or ability to be identified to a property. So it actually all comes back to property. And that's why, in terms of like American identity, the people who get the most merit to their words are the ones that have the most property. And it's like, it's it sounds so reductive, and it sounds like very binary, but that's where we are in America in terms of like our progression and where or why Joe Rogan has more influence than actual fucking doctors over people's medical decisions, or like Russell Brand, or like fucking, I guess, yeah, did I say Elon? Elon. The idea of him being anybody's source of information on anything is pretty absurd. But so many people look to him for like thoughts on the future, or thoughts on how free speech should uh, be protected, or
Well, they replaced
uh,
the CEO of Twitter recently, right?
yeah, he finally named someone else to take over,
The it's
which
they
is like,
they were an executive at what a Paramount or Peacock or something like that. My dad casually mentioned something about it. I don't know, man.
yeah,
Like
and then
it seems like that whole this whole year of Twitter nonsense has just been God, it's just so.
well, the funny thing was, once he named her, that's when the right wingers turned on him. So now they're all turning on him because she gave a speech at the World Economic Forum once. So now clearly Elon's working with the the woke agenda, and now the right wingers are like, oh, he was wearing a Baphomet suit at some shit happened last year, and now they're trying to like do the cancel culture thing on Elon, which is hilarious because it was gonna inevitably happen because the right wingers turn on everybody, including their own. But it was like him taking the right wing position to then try to appease them. He didn't. I don't think he thought they were going to turn on him, or if he did, he didn't think it was going to happen this quickly. Um, because then he tried to like, I think it was right after he tried to do the deal with Tucker Carlson, because then that may be in question because it may violate Tucker's contract. So him trying to get Tucker and then naming this woman as the his successor, it is like the right wing is done with him now. And if you go look at Twitter, it's hilarious. The conspiracy theories that they're coming up with are so fucking off the wall, where I'm like, I couldn't even make that shit up to like feed them. But he definitely is getting the, you know, he's reaping what he sowed in terms of trying to appease the right wingers. And now it's like, I wonder if that's going to make him go away from the public eye once he finally steps down. If he's like gonna have to patch up his ego from this public bruising and public beating his ego has been put through for the last year and a half. because I think he's trying to pretend that it's not getting to him, but I think it's wearing him down.
I think there's only so much anyone's ego can take,
Mhm.
especially when he's just demonstrated that he wants attention, and I think he might finally be at a point where he's had enough attention. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. They're probably going to announce a new update to their vehicles that's going to be revolutionary, or they'll come up with a new Starship modification that'll prevent the previous issue from emerging again and destroying their Starship. I need to find how much that thing cost. Oh, $62 million. They think they could get the cost down to 10 million or less, but right now it costs $62 million. Oh, that's just per launch to build it. 2 to 3 billion dollars. They blew up a 2 to 3 billion dollar
Oh wow.
capsule.
Ooh. Yeah, so I feel like it's those types of number reports that they have to keep out of the mainstream to keep their reputations from just going to absolute shit. So that's why it's like they're trying to frame it as a positive because they got some sort of telemetry readings or some shit, and it's like, but you blew up $3 billion. I don't think you planned. You definitely didn't plan to blow up $3 billion. So stop acting like this was a great success or some shit. And I think there's this element of, obviously businesses are not inclined to publicly discuss failures or even frame a failure as a failure
Hey,
publicly.
it's actually an improvement. Colombia, no, seriously, Colombia that was $13 billion in building costs that were lost. Adjusted for inflation, that's a $16.2 billion loss. And then Challenger, that in 1986, that was a $5.5 billion loss, but adjusted for inflation, that's like 11.5 billion.
But it's
So
not a loss because they're not private companies.
that's
That's
true.
not the same thing at
Okay,
all.
that's okay. No, you're right.
That's a huge difference, especially in terms of like we don't count military dollars as like loss because they're not a corporation.
Yeah.
It's an expense. It's like part of their budget, but none of it counts as a loss because they don't have to report profits. You see
Oh,
what I mean?
oh, yeah, okay, okay.
NASA doesn't have to report profits at all. This is why it's so disingenuous when people talk about the fucking post office not making money. Well, because they don't fucking have to. They don't have any shareholders to report to or any fucking dividends to pay out. So yeah, the post office doesn't need to make money. So them quote unquote reporting losses, no, that's just operating expenses. It's not a loss. Yeah, they may end up going into the positive sometimes where it would technically be a loss if their goal was to make,
It
or
looks
it
like
would be
they
a
also.
gain
It
if their
looks
goal
like
was to
they
make money.
spent an additional $8 billion building the facility. The whole Starship project at this point is estimated to cost $10 billion.
Mm.
So that's like less than a year of NASA for one project that they destroyed in a very spectacular fireworks display.
This whole the whole structure of the capital distribution and
Is that going to become a tax
private,
write-off?
yes, I
Oh,
think they get like 3 billion in tax
they're
write-off,
like
which is why it's fucked that it's a private
they're
company
not going to have to
that
pay
can then
taxes for like a year or
three
two.
billion. Yeah, it's like for like 3 billion of their operating expenses or something like that. Um, is how much they get in subsidies. So that's where I'm like,
Oh.
space, the idea of taking capitalism into space is so fucking stupid. But in the process, it's like you can't get over the capital need to get there. So there has to be some sort of uh, framed benefit or posed benefit at this point in time, which is weird because when we were competing with the fucking communists, apparently they didn't care. And they were just like, throw money at the fucking shit. We'll just we need to get something on the goddamn moon. And it doesn't matter how fucking much it costs. But now it's like, oh, private industry needs to be shuttling fucking rich people to space at $250,000 a ticket. And it's like, I don't know what this future is in terms of like, it's hard for me to fathom it because it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. Like I'm definitely a futurist in terms of trying to get to a better future, but I don't know if capitalism wants that, and I can't tell if capitalism actually wants a better future or not. So it's hard to sort of project this into anything but dystopian. And I think that's why we end up getting a lot of dystopian science fiction because like anybody who looks at these things and tries to project, it's like, well, all the corporations are like sucking the life out of everything and they're stealing the life out of everything. So where does this go unless we get rid of that corporate aspect? And that's where like all this cyberpunk corporate takeover, it feels like the natural end, but I don't know if they can survive. It just feels like the more and more we get closer, it feels like the Tower of Babel story, and I feel like that shit probably happened before in terms of like society getting so advanced, and then ultimately it tries to reach for godhood, and then basically chops itself back down to medieval because you can't reach for godhood through capitalism. It doesn't work. It's not going to work. God doesn't care about fucking money. So when we're trying to like reach for the stars to make money, we're just going to fall right back down to earth and all that shit we built up to it is going to fucking crumble. And that's where I'm like, I don't think that the Tower of Babel story was like literal, but I could totally believe that metaphor as like representing society and its uh, untethered goal of trying to become a like on the same level as God. Because if you do it in an untethered way, of course it's going to result in disaster. And that's where I think in terms of like reaching the notion of godhood as a species is definitely possible, but it won't be for the sake of money. And if anything, it would just be for the pure sake of survival, which is like a totally noble goal, but not to do with capital. So, on the one hand, when we live in a world where we need capital to survive, it seems like the pursuit of capital is intrinsically tied, but that's just a limitation of the time. And it's a very small sliver of life's existence in terms of like, if we're looking at the existence of capital exchange relative to all of life's existence, if it's a clock, that's less than a fucking second in the 24 hours of existence that capital has been used to influence how things live. Even in human time, it's going to be a very small part of the clock, which is where that to me makes it as to why a focus on it's not that capital is bad. but survival is more important than capital. And when capital becomes an impediment to too many humans surviving, that framework makes it difficult for anyone to actually fathom survival beyond the capitalism. And that's where I think, in terms of like capitalism versus communism, that's not it to me. It's capitalism versus survival. And I think if capitalism is the goal, inherent survival is no longer the goal. And I think that's where, when we're in a capitalist society, the propaganda and all of the things that are trying to make capitalism survive that we've been told don't take into account the rest of the species that doesn't even have to not just be living under capitalism. It's just anybody else. Anybody else is not not being taken into account in terms of that projection, which is why we get imperialist actions, why we send our militaries to other places for our survival, as if our uh, morals and existence is more important than their survival. That's capitalism doing that because it's trying to keep itself surviving. So that's where I'm looking at it in terms of like, this isn't about economic systems. This isn't about what's the next economic system. This is about, will capitalism allow us to survive without it? And I don't think it will. And that's where I feel like this doom and this like dystopian sci-fi propaganda is capitalism trying to make us feel like we can't survive without it.
What do you do without my supply chains?
Who will harvest the fruits if not someone getting paid?
How will you pay them? Capitalism.
Well, and that's, I don't know if you've seen the videos going around of like the work sites in Florida that are completely abandoned.
No, I've not.
Well, okay. So this is interesting in terms of like a lot of the fucking narratives that right wing extremists want to push are, oh my god, obviously they're not in line with reality. But this shit is coming to an end in terms of like, yeah, guess what? If the right wingers make it so hostile here that people aren't wanting to like contribute, they'll fucking leave. And effectively, there were rumors in Florida that they were going to start cracking down on illegal workers because of Ron DeSantis. And he's like hyping up his language for the election in terms of like, I think he's gearing up to run for president potentially. So he was like getting all chest puffed out about, we're going to go after the illegal immigrants and stuff. Well, these motherfuckers left. And there's like a bunch of fucking work sites in Florida that are like half finished and half complete, and nobody to actually complete them because they were leaning so hard on illegal work that they were gonna look the other way for the developers that are hiring these workers and let them just build these fucking all these new developments using the immigrants, but then go crack down on the immigrants and not the developers. So that's where all this shit is sitting incomplete. And it'll be interesting to see how long it lasts. But if it lasts throughout the year and all of these properties start deteriorating, we're gonna see. I think we'll see a shift in the tone of rhetoric from the right wing people like DeSantis, because they're gonna realize they can't keep trying to appeal to the far right and in the process scaring away the people that they actually depend on. And I think that's like we're seeing. Oh, okay. When COVID hit, the very first edge of COVID really cut down on the immigration in terms of like it just wasn't happening as much because the jobs weren't as available, the development wasn't happening. So immigration already started falling with COVID. And then if you get immigration falling even more because Republican rhetoric makes people not want to uh, come to the country legally or illegally, it's going to have ramifications in their strategies that they.
Well, you know, there was a kind of an economic experiment in Kansas where they really cracked down on migrant workers and immigrants and illegal immigrants and all that, or illegal immigrants. And Western Kansas, the economy of Western Kansas collapsed, and I'm pretty sure that the state of Kansas that year had to borrow like $500 million from the government, to the federal government, to make their budget function just through the end of the year, so they could come up with a new budget. It decimated the economy of Western Kansas. I remember reading this pages long article in New York Times where they interviewed, you know, property owners, farmers, and all that kind of stuff, and they all had complaints. And it's like, oh yeah, a few of these people realized that their economies were, you know, built on migrant labor. But you know, that was long. I guess that was like a decade ago. People forgot. So Florida gets to have its economy punched in the gut for a little while, and some people are going to suffer. And you know, I think with politics, at least from what I've observed, it seems like people seem to get what they deserve at some point. They get the representatives they deserve.
Yep.
And
America's getting the economy it deserves.
yeah. Well, hopefully the people get the message. There's going to be a government net program. It won't change anything. I'm not even convinced that if they had taught people how to use the credit system 20 years ago, if it would have changed anything.
You know, I often wonder about the same thing, and in terms of like, but almost the opposite. Like, what if that money was given directly instead of to credit companies? Like, what would that look like in terms of changing the landscape of um, poverty? And I think that's where like America definitely depends upon at least some people being in need to function the way it does now. And it doesn't have to function this way, but there is this like forcing people to work because they need to survive is like at the crux of how things operate, because ultimately somebody is going to have to pay a bill. And if that includes, like, if that results in them having to do something that they don't want to do, the American economy doesn't give a fuck. And then it almost depends on that in terms of like getting people to that point where they're like, okay, I'll do this for $1 because I need to eat or I need to pay this bill or whatever. And then in the process, you have the rhetoric of people for one reason or another who are like, well, you should just be happy that you're able to, and you should just be happy that that quote unquote opportunity is given to you. But those people generally don't have to suffer the worst scenarios of what that plays out to be. And so I think that's where America, as a land of right to work or the opportunity to work, gives the appearance of opportunity as a means of betterment, when in reality it's usually just an opportunity to like do enough to keep yourself from fucking dying or to keep from becoming homeless or some shit, where it's like you're never actually given an opportunity or earning an opportunity to um, improve your life situation. Uh, and that's where, again, I don't I don't say that as a pessimist, thinking that that's the only alternative of existence. It's just the poor management of resources is how we got there, but then a lack of creative thought about the transitions out of it. And on the one hand, like it, I see it collapse, into it's like lowest or minimum viable operating uh entity, but then it starts to grow from there, and that's where I don't see a pessimistic into this in terms of like how it ultimately ends, but there is this danger of assuming the trajectory we're on is even sustainable, as far as like the Zuckerbergs buying up a bunch of companies and trying to consolidate their visions into one that he came up with, or Elon buying up a bunch of different companies and consolidating their vision into one that he came up with. Um, and that's where, like, I don't know if it began with emperors or pharaohs, or when it got to a point where individuals thought that they had enough foresight and um, intelligence to try to direct an entire economy. But now that we're at a point where we do it out of tradition and we do it in the sense of like, oh yeah, we have a fucking president that we vote on that makes the agenda for the country for 4 years at a time. And it's just so normalized that we can't fathom, not you and I, but as a American
Yeah,
people, we
collectively.
couldn't fathom, yeah, collectively, anything different than that, which is like, it's crazy, but it's not really unexpected that people who grow up with a president can't fathom what it would be like without a president. So I don't hold that against Americans. Um,
Meanwhile, in Switzerland, some kid just busts in the door and says, "Mommy, mommy, did you know that Americans have to vote, but their vote doesn't matter?" And then the Swiss mom's like, "Yes, dear, we know." That's how I imagine it. Like in other democracies where they have where everyone votes and they actually vote. They're just like, how could that even function? We don't know.
it's definitely um, eye-opening when you go to a functional democracy in terms of how they see us. Um, but even then, it's like I guess America is a bunch of different things trying to be one thing.
Well, yeah, it's a democratic republic of states. It's complicated. It couldn't be easy. It had to be layered.
Like when the EU still had Britain in it, it was very difficult to put some sort of label on the EU as, what it's like because the countries are so different within it. But I think as America, it's like easy to lump it all together as if because there's Walmarts everywhere that the culture is the same everywhere.
Man, the culture of Walmart is different from state to state because they have different demographics to compile their inventories. I bet that I know that the Walmart in China is different because they have like a wet market, but uh, I wonder what it's like in, I don't know. Does Walmart exist in Canada? How different is it there? Is there a Walmart in Mexico? I mean, there has to be, right?
I think so because I feel like they were trying to stop one from getting put in on native land at some point.
You can't stop Walmart. They're so powerful, they were able to create a freaking online marketplace to rival Amazon in the span of the first year of COVID. They went from an absolutely terrible online shopping experience to literally their version of Amazon overnight practically. That is some actual might. You can't stop Amazon or Walmart either. I guess an entire country could, but then they'd be missing out on cheap products from China.
Well, it turns out Walmart owns most of the supermarkets in Mexico.
You can't beat Walmart. It's just part of their plan.
There's about one Walmart-owned store per 47,000 Mexicans.
Oh, wow. Oh man, so we might actually end up with the corporate dystopia of Blade Runner, but it'll just be it'll be Amazon versus Walmart versus Alibaba versus Aldi, Aldi Joe Corp, whatever those brothers, and then who else? Who else is one of the mega corps that's going to emerge to own everything? Obviously, one of Elon's products is going to emerge to own a big portion of Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. At least he'll try. That's my prediction.
Here at Rock.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos shows produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.